Hi, everybody. I'm James Gardner, the host of Your History, Your Story. And this October, we will be celebrating 4 years since our very first episode. And that's pretty exciting for us. But over the 4 years, we've been receiving some questions from people like, what are your favorite episodes? Why did you launch this podcast? What's your background, James? So my wife Kelly and I, who I do the podcast with, we both spoke about it and said, why don't we come up with an idea where somebody could interview me and ask me those questions? This way, our listeners will know. So we thought about our daughter, Katie, who has a great voice, and she is well aware of what we do to put on this podcast. So she is here today, and I'm going to introduce her. Katie DeFrank, welcome to our podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yes, well, we're going to be listening to me talk. Isn't that great? So, Katie, you've heard all the stuff that goes on with our podcast, so you're pretty familiar with everything, but you also know about the questions that were asked.
Yes.
So you've been briefed on those. So could you sort of take over from here?
Absolutely.
All right, here's Katie.
Thank you. So to start, I want to ask you, what made you choose the title Your History, Your Story for your podcast? Because I know that there were a lot of options that you guys were trying to think of at the start. And what made you land on that as your title?
Sure. So, as you know, we sent out some family questionnaires and we extended it to other people outside the family, friends, about the types of names that we wanted to use. And we landed on Your History, Your Story because we wanted to really have it encourage people to tell stories and that their stories are important. Everybody's got a story to tell, not just somebody who's famous or somebody, was a musician or a politician or whatever. Everybody's got a story to tell, and it's personal.
Mm-hmm.
And it could be that that person has a story to tell about an interest of theirs, something they've been researching, or it could be that they themselves had an adventure or something crazy that went on in their lives or interesting, or there's somebody in their family tree who did something or was notable in some way that who they want to talk about them. Mm-hmm. So we thought that that title for the podcast kind of says, your stories are important.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I love that. And I know that you have talked in a couple of your episodes giving little kind of tidbits here and there about your own story. You've talked about your father before in one episode and given a little background, but when it comes to your love for history, can you tell us a little bit about that, about your background and how history became such an important part of your life?
Oh, I'd love to answer that question because I love history. I really do. I have a passion for it. As long as I can remember, and I've given tidbits of this in some of my other podcasts, but as long as I can remember, I've found history interesting. My family used to take 2 vacations a year. One vacation was in the summertime. We'd go down to the beach with our friends and we would just have a great time. Or we went to some other beach type of a place. And that was a great experience. It was something to generate stories, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then there was a second vacation. The second vacation was some historic related place. We went to Williamsburg, Virginia. We went to Gettysburg. We went up to, I'm trying to think of some of the other places too, Fort Ticonderoga, all these different places, and we would learn history. And when I went to these places and stood on a battlefield, and I tried to imagine what it was like, and my mom and dad both loved to talk about history. And my mother, as you know, grandma was English, so she would be curious because some of these places she hadn't seen, and this is American history. And that was really kind of cool. My parents got me some books that I love to read, but I think my love of history was nurtured by my family, my mom and dad, but also other relatives.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you've heard us talk about Grandy.
Many times. Yes.
Grandy, yes. That's where I got my bald head from Grandy. He was born in Ireland, He married my grandmother. They met at the end of World War One.
Yeah, so Grandy's your grandfather.
My grandfather, my maternal grandfather, and he was in both the First and Second World War. He also chauffeured for royalty. He chauffeured for the Earl of Athlone, whose wife was the youngest grandchild, I think, of Queen Victoria.
Wow.
And these are stories I heard from Grandy. So we'd go down on a Friday night. The whole apartment was filled with cigar and cigarette smoke. It was a really healthy environment for a child, right?
Sounds it.
Yes. And it would be every Friday night, my parents, my brother, Keith, and I. And it would be just a lot of fun. And I would just sit and listen. I mean, there wasn't much to do in this little apartment.
You didn't have an iPad or anything?
No iPad, no iPhone, little black and white TV that only got like 6 channels or whatever it was. And I would sit there and I heard about, my grandfather's unit, the Royal Air Force unit, being strafed by the German planes as they were fleeing to the English Channel in 1940. But he also told stories about when he was a boy in Ireland, and he claimed he saw what he called a banshee, which is, I guess, is a female ghost of some sort. And my grandmother and my mother would sort of like give me a kind of a look that the story kind of grew each time he told it.
Who does that sound like?
Yours truly. So, yeah, the stories were just engaging, and I couldn't get enough of them. He told me some really sad stories. Like one of his jobs was that he was transport. He drove a truck, and the sergeant who was his boss at the time was in charge of reinterring dead soldiers from the battlegrounds in Europe in World War One. So he was in charge of bringing this guy around, and it was kind of you can imagine, a very grim job. So he told about that. But my grandfather and I spent time doing some other things. I used to sleep over their house on Friday nights, and he took me fishing once. So we had some good times. But the things I remember the most are the stories. I could continue. May I?
Yes, please.
Okay. Another story. My father used to tell me stories, bedtime stories, about old football players from the 1930s and 40s. And he used to talk about like athletes like Jim Thorpe. And he talked about, who was from an even earlier time. He told stories about, witches in a little cottage in the woods, and the woodsman captured the witch, put her in the oven, and turned her into a big cookie. These stories, but he used to tell these stories. My mother used to talk about England and Anne Boleyn getting her head chopped off and all these things. So,
very child appropriate.
yeah, I don't know how appropriate, but I loved every minute of it, But there was an Uncle Ken I had. He was actually a great uncle of mine. Lived up in Scranton, Pennsylvania. And he used to come down, maybe once a year to pick up my grandmother with his wife, and they would go back to Scranton, and Grandma would go there and visit with them. But when he was down visiting us, we would go to a place called Holston's in Bloomfield. Some of you may know. Do you know what that was famous for?
Burgers and ice cream, right?
Burgers and ice cream. But one other thing, there was a famous TV show
I don't remember.
called The Sopranos.
Oh my gosh.
And the last episode of The Sopranos.
I should know that.
Last episode of The Sopranos was actually filmed in Holston's.
Really?
Yes.
I actually did not know that.
Yes, but we went, this is back in the 70s, and we went with them. Anytime they came down, my uncle would say, "You should really come on up and visit with us. Come up, we'll go fishing." I didn't really like fishing because I felt sorry for the fish. Go figure. But I figured, okay, yeah, I'll go sometime. Well, one time it was in the summer between my junior and senior year in high school. I was just in the process of getting my driver's license. I had all my friends around, right? It was all really exciting, all sorts of stuff going on. And they called my bluff. And my uncle said, "We want James to come up for a week up in Scranton, Pennsylvania." And I thought, oh, no, I love them. I love my uncle and my aunt, but I didn't want to just be there away from my friends and all that stuff. How am I going to practice driving? All this, that, and the other. So I went, and I brought my fishing rod and all that stuff. Well, I am so thankful that I went to this day. here I am, 65 years old. I was 17 at the time. I spent days out on little lakes in the middle of northeastern Pennsylvania.
Mm-hmm.
He was regaling me in stories about his grandfather, who he used to go fishing with,
Mm-hmm.
who had fought in the Civil War. He was at the Battle of Petersburg. He went in as a drummer boy, but they couldn't afford drummer boys. They just needed infantrymen. So he had to throw the drum away.
Mm-hmm.
And he told me so many stories. I just felt like I was connecting with a much earlier time. And the trouble was, though, he couldn't hear very well.
Mm-hmm.
So he would talk to me, and anytime I said anything back,
Screaming.
he'd say, huh? And so I ended up screaming out in the middle of this lake. But we communicated. He was wonderful.
Aw.
Great story. So there's that. So there was this rich storytelling time. And
Mm-hmm.
even like I remember on those Friday nights with my grandparents and my aunt and my parents, and I remember them talking about the Vietnam War. I just remember my mother and father, who Grandma and Grandpa Jack met at the end of World War II.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And that was so cool. So I guess I had that built in me. And then, of course, I love to read books and watch anything historic. And
Mm-hmm.
that's kind of what drove me to love storytelling and history.
Yeah.
Sorry for the long story.
No, it's totally fine. It's actually, as you're talking, it's making me think, hearing about how you grew to love history and thinking about Grandy, your grandfather, and telling you stories, and your uncle, how you did that for me. And probably my sisters too, but they studied well on their own, whereas I did not. So it makes me think about history classes, and in elementary school all the way up through high school, already, but for the listeners, I was not an academic by any means. I was a social butterfly. I really could have cared less about school. And so, in the rare occasion that I actually studied, especially for history tests, I remember to this day, I always did well on the ones that you helped me study for. And it's not because you just drilled facts into my head. You helped me care about what I was studying for. And I remember us sitting down at the table together, and you would whip out the big textbook that I had, and you'd kind of do a quick review, and then you would say, all right. And then you go in and you would just explain things to me in story form. And I remember not only I did well on those tests because I actually did something to prepare for them, but you helped me because you made it more real for me in your storytelling. So you just, I think, just in your background with helping me, and then hearing how you've told stories to other people throughout my whole upbringing, you help people to care because it makes it feel more real to them.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
That's nice. I'm glad. I mean, that's the only way I could learn was through stories. Because if I had to memorize facts,
Forget it.
all I'd have to do is, just one little slip up and it could jumble the whole mess. But if you remember it as a story,
Mm-hmm.
now you're talking. But I do remember something, if I could trigger your memory,
Mm-hmm.
about how you had a test that you really hadn't studied for.
Which one?
It doesn't narrow it down, right?
Yes.
But something that you depended on another story, and it wasn't from me to get your answers.
Yes. I remember the word Poland, and I was in high school, and we were taking a history test, and I can't even remember the how the question was phrased, but there was a question about who Germany invaded in a certain year, which this is bad, I can't remember. But I remembered the answer was Poland. And the only reason I knew that was because of another way that you kind of incorporated history into our lives growing up, was from the British comedy series called Fawlty Towers. And that was something we watched so many times. And there was a certain episode where this main character had said something to German guests that were staying at his inn and said, well, you started it with the war because you invaded Poland. And that is the only reason that I got that answer right, not because I studied for it. And it's just funny looking back, hearing, kind of thinking about these things that impacted me, that are, historical, and how it wasn't just through studying for tests. It was even just in these fun shows that we used to watch, and how those kind of still got drilled into me over the years, for some appreciation of history.
Now I know stories do that. Now I know that on like Netflix and other, other TV, there are a lot of historical dramas.
Mhm.
And I actually think they're, most of them are wonderful because they do, they just tell stories and people are picking up information. I know mom, when mom and I watch those, mom loves the fact that she's never been a big person who loves history. She's got a lot of other interests,
Mhm.
but she likes the story. And when she hears the story, then she says, hey, that's pretty cool. That's really cool because it's a story. But I know a lot of people have had problems in school with history class. They're dry, there's facts, who
Mhm.
needs to know it, and all that, and people
Yeah.
grumble.
Yep.
I know, uh, a lot of people, older people have said to me, I love history, but as a kid, I didn't like it because we were just required to know the facts and there was no
Right.
story behind it.
Hmm.
So I think when you guys were kids, I mean, I always liked stories because I like to tell stories because I like to hear stories,
Hmm.
which we're going to talk about maybe a little later, is
Yeah.
the telling and hearing,
Hmm.
and of course recording
Right.
those
Right.
stories is important.
Yeah. And I know we're talking a lot about school, and that's just making me think about your background, your educational background. You did not originally start out your career with anything really related to history. I know it was part of your studies when you were in college, but
Hmm.
can you tell us a little bit about the educational background that you had, and how, how you started off, and then really how history started to become worked into what you did?
Sure. Well, I went to college, Moravian College in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. We did an episode on Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, Christmas City. Great episode. Mom and I had a blast going out there, and working with the people out there. But I went to Moravian College. I majored in history, so I just I just loved the classes they offered in history there. They were really good. And my minor was in business management, but I really didn't have really no interest in it at all. And people say, well, what are you going to do with a history degree? Well, I don't know. I mean, I just wanted to get a degree.
Mm.
Really, I'd really spent a lot of time thinking about my future.
Yeah.
So eventually what happened was I got my degree and I was thinking about maybe being a teacher of history, being a late baby boomer, the baby boomers were leaving the school system.
Hmm.
Some schools were shutting down, actually, and they just weren't hiring. If they were hiring more math and science teachers and not as many history teachers and English and stuff like that. So and I hadn't even taken education classes to go along with it, so I'd have to do that too. And I just looked for the first job I could get,
Mm.
and it was in a billing department at a company, and I was typing up invoices. Yes, typing invoices with a suit on. And I remember this one, more of a old-fashioned old-timer guy, nice guy and everything like that, but he was appalled that a man was actually typing. I remember that.
Really?
Yeah. And I said, hey, it's a job. I'm typing. What? I mean, it was real old style thinking,
Mm.
And I did that. And I continued there and I got hired and I kind of liked the people I worked with.
Hmm.
And then, of course, it really worked out because I met mom, because mom's dad, your
Yeah.
papa, your grandfather,
Yeah.
was my boss's boss. And I worked there and I started to like it, and I went back and got an MBA in finance because people were saying, what are you going to do with a history degree?
Hmm.
I don't know. What am I going to do with a history degree?
Famous question.
I had to answer at any time. If I went for interviews, why history? What are you going to do with it? I don't know.
Mhm.
And what I would do, I would make little excuses for it.
Really? How so?
I always loved history. I like it, but what are you going to do with it? Well, I just wanted to learn more about it. What are you going to do with it? I don't know. I don't know. But I'm going to go for my master's, or I'm going for my master's in finance. So I
Mhm.
sort of buried that.
Mm.
I changed a lot since then.
Yep.
That
Yep.
sort of thinking. So I got that degree. It helped with my career. I was in finance, accounting, auditing.
Yep.
A lot of traveling at some points I did on audits and things. It was never my passion, and I did it for 40 years.
Oh.
However, I met some wonderful people. I've
Mhm.
met some really cool people, and I think that's a big part of it.
Mhm.
I had some fun,
Yeah.
but some good people worked with fine people. So that happened. And then, of course, as you know, because you were going for your master's while
Yes.
I went for another master's
Right.
in theological studies.
Yep. We were doing it at the same time.
Yep, yep. Both of us, mom kept saying that she saw the tops of our heads just looking down at our computers.
Yep.
Yep. I went for a master's MA at Liberty University, but I did it all online.
Mhm.
And because my faith is very important to me. And I wanted to learn more about the Bible and studying. And no surprise, my biggest interest was in church history,
Mm.
which I loved.
40 years in the finance industry. And obviously, there were a lot of really great people, and I'm sure experiences that came from that. But it still sounds like history. So history got put on the back burner for a while, right? What point in time did it start to trickle back in?
I'd say to some degree, it never stopped. Uh, Mom can attest to the number of books that I have at home.
Mm-hmm.
I remember having a birthday party years ago, and people asked Mom, what does he like? She said he loves history, she loves books, he loves lighthouses.
Yep.
So he loves history, particularly the Civil War. I got about 8 books on the Civil War, a couple little plastic lighthouses, and a book on lighthouses.
I remember those. Yes.
So
Took it and ran.
exactly. But I still love reading, and I kept doing that. But that was the only way I kept that up. All right. So what happened when Mom, as you know, worked for a seniors community,
Mm-hmm.
and she was in the recreation department, and she actually was coming up with ideas to, put on programs for the seniors, and they came up with an idea of doing Jeopardy.
Mm-hmm.
And Jeopardy, they needed a host, and Mom
Yeah.
volunteered me to be Alex Trebek. And it was a lot of fun. I just asked the questions. I tried to make it entertaining. We
Mm-hmm.
we came up with the questions. I forget how we did it, but there was probably a lot of history questions because I know at this place they loved history, and it was just a lot of fun. So that was kind of my first. Oh, I get to do something other than just read a book and
Yeah.
interact with history. But then what happened was when your sister Jen was in 5th grade.
Mm-hmm.
At this time, by the way, I had just overcome the most horrendous case of
You're gonna say.
chickenpox that
Yes.
somebody brought home to our house.
That would be me for anyone listening. Yes.
But the chickenpox were just starting to dissipate. I got sent on a business trip. I remember I was miserable, and I came back, and then I found out. Oh, by the way, remember we had that conversation? Jennifer said to me, I had that conversation with my teacher. She wants you to come in and give a talk on the Revolutionary War because I told her you were an expert. Yeah, which I wasn't,
Mm-hmm.
but I did know quite a bit about it. And anyway, I went into the class, and Mom and I went down to the Jockey Hollow Museum in Morristown, New Jersey. We got a few little gifts to give out to the kids. It was like old currency from the Revolutionary War, artificial. It wasn't real. And anyway, we I spoke to the kids, and they were engaged, and they had a lot of fun, and I had a lot of fun. They were a little terrified at all the spots all over my face, but anyway, as you know, the next year, you
My turn. Yeah.
your turn, and your sister Jamie. So
Mm-hmm.
3 years on that.
And I actually remember that. I remember you coming in. I even remember, I always tell, you and mom that I feel like I have a photographic memory. And I remember on the blackboard at the time, way back then, they had the order of the day and the subjects. And I remember seeing Mr. Gardner on the board and just how exciting that was, knowing that you were coming in and everybody was going to get to see my dad. And I remember you coming in and talking to everybody about it. And it was just so exciting to hear you tell stories to the class. And I remember everybody was like very engaged too. For young kids, in elementary school, it might seem really hard to think, are they actually going to care about something that happened so long ago? And you did. You made that happen.
Well, I had fun doing it, and at first I was terrified. I thought that the 10-year-olds are going to like charge me with pitchforks and torches.
Yeah, it was very cool. I remember that. I remember, my sister Jen really enjoying when you did that. You did that for our younger sister Jamie too. So that was awesome. So you you did the Jeopardy at the senior living facility, and that was kind of like an intro into, I can tell stories to people or at least interact with them about history. Then you did the visiting lectures, let's say, to the elementary school. What happened after that then? What was the next step for you?
The next step was even bigger because, as you know, Mom was the recreation person along with another person, and they decided that they wanted to try out having me maybe come to give a lecture. Now, I'd never really given a lecture on
Hmm.
anything. I've been lectured to.
That's beside the point.
But I thought, well, what am I going to do? So Mom said, well, you love presidents. Why don't you choose presidential tidbits and trivia? And I thought, well, that's kind of cool. So I went in, and it was just so well received. I was telling stories, they interacted with me. It was just a lot of fun. So I came back again and
Mhm.
again. And then there was a little network of these senior living places,
Mhm.
and they started talking to other senior living places. And I ended up going all over the place. And Mom and I were going, oh gosh, I don't know. We were up to, at 1 month, I think we did like five of
Wow.
them. Sometimes it was once a month, sometimes it was more.
Hmm.
Sorry. But we also, this was after work, but I worked fairly locally, and I was able to get to these places in the evening. Now, we had top state of the art equipment. We had an overhead projector with an acetate slide.
I was like, no, you didn't. What are you talking about?
Yeah.
And when you think truly old school, right? And I'm sorry, just bringing up the projector, you did one of your lectures, and I think this was the presidential tidbits and trivia. That was like one of the favorites, right? Can you just tell everybody about the slide that Jen made?
Oh, yeah. One of the stories I told was how George Washington's mother was a real power to contend with, and not necessarily in a good way.
Hmm.
She used to sometimes pick on her son and, saying, you're neglecting me while he was like leading an army or president of the United States, you're neglecting me. And so I came up with uh, a story about his mother, and we thought we need a slide of some sort. And there were no pictures of, it was Mary Lincoln, not Mary Lincoln, Mary Washington.
Yeah.
Didn't have a picture of her. So what we did was we took a picture of George Washington's face,
Yep.
and then your sister drew a woman in 18th century costume
Yes.
on the slide.
Like with a brooch and everything. So Washington's head was superimposed onto this, you know, amateur woman's body that Jen just made probably in minutes. And that's the slide that you put up for everybody to
Yeah.
look at. So that I remember everybody would always laugh whenever they saw that. That was funny though. I remember that.
Yeah. They like that better than my lecture. Yeah, but we did those, and we went all over the place. We spoke to the Daughters of the American Revolution. We spoke to like Kiwanis clubs, Lions clubs, you name it. Libraries. We spoke at the University of Southern New Hampshire.
Hmm.
We spoke there, and that was fun. We did that. That was actually Lizzie Borden we spoke about.
That's right.
Mm.
Yeah.
And it was the weekend after 9/11, so we felt a little funny about even doing it because it was violence related.
Hmm.
So I tempered it down a little bit, and but we went. The people did enjoy it. They found it interesting. But I think one of the things that Mom and I got out of it that was so much fun was that we met. You're talking about, say, late 1990s through, oh, I don't know, about 2010 or so, maybe later. I don't know if I get the dates right, but particularly the back in the 90s, early 2000s, there were some elderly people alive who really, I mean, they went back in history, and
Hmm.
there was a lot of very interesting things that they experienced. We were at a place once, and it was after the lecture, and this little lady, she must have been in her late 80s, she came out. She had something to show me before we got to the car, and it was a picture of the Lincoln Memorial. And it was colorized, like those old photographs. They used to
Hmm.
have a person color them.
Yeah.
So I said, "Oh, this is nice." She said, "Well, there's a little story behind it." And I said, "Well, what's that?" And she said, "Well, when I was a little girl, my father was a caretaker at a place called Hildene. And Hildene was in Vermont. I think it's Vermont, still there. Was the home of Robert Todd Lincoln, the son
Yeah.
of Abraham Lincoln and Mary Todd Lincoln. And her dad was the caretaker. And one day, this woman, as a little girl, was recovering from tonsillitis. And Mrs. Robert Todd Lincoln came to the house and gave her a little present to make her feel better. It was a picture of the Lincoln Memorial, and she showed it to us. I was able to hold it. It was very interesting.
Wow. That is
Yeah.
so cool.
We had another story where a man he had been on a double date with Margaret Truman, Harry Truman's daughter. Another, I think it was a man he and his dad went fishing with Herbert Hoover.
Hmm.
There
Hmm.
was a lot of cool stuff. Another man's father-in-law was a bodyguard of Woodrow Wilson. So we learned from the people we
Yeah.
were telling stories to.
And I think it's so cool though that you got to have that experience because, you know, you think about teaching young children about history. They could be very interested, but they might not have those kinds of memories, right? To share that the older population did. So I think that's awesome that you got to learn from other people too. So now you did the lectures for about how long? Because that was called time machine talks when you were doing the lectures at the senior facilities.
Yep.
What happened after that? Like how long did you do that? And then what was afterwards?
Well, I'd have to guess at the dates, but I think it was about 1997 was when I had the chicken pox. So that was a starting time. And back then in about 2015, my job location changed to Connecticut, a significantly longer commute. And by the time I was home, I was tapped out, exhausted. We just couldn't do the traveling to some of these places we drove pretty far to go to
Mm-hmm.
sometimes. Most were local. And we just talked about it. And, our equipment was old. We would have had to update that. And we just stopped doing it, frankly.
It seems like it just kind of faded out. And was there anything in between that and the podcast?
When the commute hit, that's where it really got rough. So it was sort of I don't want to say a doldrum, but there was a period of time where we just had other stuff going on, and the family stuff to be taken care of, and
Right.
our Aunt Audrey was ill, and
Right,
things
right.
like that. But you want to hear about the podcast?
Yes, please.
All right. All right. Let's say the year is 2020. At this point, I've actually retired from full-time work. The pandemic, as you know, everybody
Mm-hmm.
knows, was in full swing. And we had some friends, our friends John and Shalene were over, and Mom and I were just having dinner with them, and they said, do you miss the talks and things like that? I said, I do, but it was just too much, and we're out of it. I think we threw out the old overhead and all the acetates, which mom
It's fine.
mom like it was too low tech.
Yeah.
And that was fine. And we said, well, we don't know what to do. But I was asking them something about their family and their family history and all that. And they said, well, do you miss giving the talks? Yes. You like to hear family history. Not only, not only do you like to tell your own, but you like to hear others.
Mm-hmm.
And they said, why don't you guys do a podcast? And this way you can keep like doing your lecturing sort of, but sort of make it something about storytelling or
Yeah.
asking people their stories.
Mm-hmm. What did you think about that initially when they put that out there to you?
What's a podcast?
Not to date yourself, but so when you found out what a podcast actually was, then what were your honest thoughts about doing that?
I thought it was a good idea, but if you know me, me agreeing that something's a good idea and implementing it,
Yeah.
as Mom well knows, she's like the motivating factor in it. Like,
Yep.
for instance, the Roadcaster, the piece of equipment that we use, and
Yes.
the microphones and all that stuff. It wasn't long after that time with John and Shalene that was ordered. So Mom didn't let any moss grow on that
Yep.
idea. But it arrived in a box,
Mm-hmm.
and we plugged it in, and it looked cool. There's a lot of colors and different buttons and all
Yeah.
that stuff.
And
And
you're totally overwhelmed.
totally. It was cool when we opened it and plugged it in, but then we had to do something with it. Your mom was very committed to learning the editing process and what
Mm-hmm.
that meant. How do you record? How do you edit? How do you post?
Mm-hmm.
How do you advertise? How do you get it on social media? Where to get it on social media? All those things. Mostly Mom did this part, and she leveraged some experts at our church
Mm-hmm.
who were very kind. You know, our son-in-law, Sean, as well, helped with some things as well. And all you guys were, you're very encouraging in that. But Mom learned it. She got down on the learning
Yeah.
curve. And
Yeah.
we started, if you listen to our first few episodes, you can say, oh, I wish they were a little bit better than that. But uh, got down on the curve, started to get some interesting guests almost out of the gate.
Mm.
Almost out of the gate.
Yeah.
So that's how it all started. That was in October of 2020 that we actually published our first episode, but it started a couple months before that.
Mm-hmm.
When we started to learn.
Yeah. I actually, speaking of the interesting guests, because I know that, all of your episodes are really cool because there's such a variety of the type of guests that you have and the experiences. When I first learned that you were doing a history podcast, I truly thought it was going to be all war related. And it was not like that. I mean, you have some of that kind of historical information in some of the podcasts, but then there's people's life stories. There have been, interviews that you've done from people who experienced 9/11 in the Twin Towers, and just health issues and people's stories with those. What were some of the guest stories that you remember that really just like captivated you and had an impact on you?
Well, that's a good question. I've been thinking about this a lot because these are some of the questions we've gotten from people over the years. it's hard for me to narrow it down because there have been so many interesting guests who, by the way, there's many of them have now become our friends. So we're
Mm-hmm.
in touch with them. We've gotten together with people. I can't tell you how many people. So when I select a few here,
Yeah.
it's not to negate any of the other ones who have been
Right.
really special to us. But one of the ones I wanted to lead with, sorry, is back in the early days of the podcast. I think it may even have been before we started the podcast. I was I was thinking of who would I want to speak to, who would be interesting that I could reach out to. And I found somewhere that this woman named Betty Ann Bruno
Mm-hmm.
was one of the very last surviving Munchkins from The Wizard of Oz. Now, she wasn't one of the little people. She wasn't under that contract, but she was a child actress
Mm-hmm.
who was used with probably a dozen or 2 dozen children to sort of fill out the ranks
Mm-hmm.
of the Munchkins,
Yep.
1939. And she was 7 years old, and she had actually appeared in The Wizard of Oz. She went on to become a very successful broadcaster, news reporter. She was just a very talented lady, and also a hula instructor.
At what age?
Well, when I interviewed her, I think she was 89, but I'll tell you about that in a second. But I I went on Facebook. I sent her a message. Would you be interested in talking and for a future
Mm-hmm.
interview or whatever?
Mm-hmm.
Didn't hear for months. I figured, well, that fell flat. And then in the meantime, in the early part of our podcast, we were able to interview uh, Chris Costello, Lou Costello, the comedian's daughter.
Yep.
So that we started getting some moment. The amazing Kreskin,
Mm-hmm.
Michael Francis, the
Yes.
former organized crime person.
Mm-hmm.
He's a wonderful guy.
A lot of cool people.
He's doing great work. And all of a sudden, we got a message from Betty Ann Bruno's husband, who monitored her Facebook page, and said that she would be interested in doing an interview.
Mm-hmm.
So we had a pre-call. We hit it off. What a wonderful lady.
Mm-hmm.
And we just had fun and we laughed, and she told the most incredible behind the scenes stories.
Yeah.
She wrote a book as well. Please go to the episode, anybody, if you haven't seen
Mm-hmm.
the Betty Ann Bruno episode. But anyway, what happened was we interviewed her. It was fantastic, but we stayed in touch, and we wrote emails to each other. And we found out one time that she was actually going to be in New Jersey. She lives in Sonoma. She lived in Sonoma, California.
Mm-hmm.
And we had dinner with her and her husband and their friends, and it was a wonderful evening. We stayed in touch. And then last July, she sent me a birthday present. In the middle of July was my birthday. She sent me the birthday present, and then I called her and told her that, I thanked her, and then I said to her that my granddaughter wants to watch The Wizard of Oz. She's never seen it.
Yep.
She
Yep.
said, "Oh, that's so cool." So we were May and
Yeah.
I were your daughter May and I were watching Wizard of Oz, and Grandma,
Mm-hmm.
aka Mom,
Yep.
snapped a picture of us, and she sent it in an email to Betty Ann, and Betty Ann responded, "Oh, how lovely and how cute. That's wonderful." And we lost Betty Ann, I think about 2 or 3 days later.
Wow.
We got a message from her husband that she passed away.
Wow.
And just only days after we had spoken with her. It was very sad, but she was 91 years old. She had just finished a hula demonstration. She was 91.
That's
I mean,
amazing.
she rocked it. I mean, she killed it. She was great. And
Oh.
but then she had a headache. She went to the hospital and she passed away. But
Mm-hmm.
really wonderful guest. Another one, his name is John Luckadoo.
Mm-hmm.
He is 102 years old. His nickname is Lucky Luckadoo. He was a B-17 bomber pilot during World War II. He flew 25 missions over enemy-occupied Europe. I interviewed him with the co-author of his book.
Mhm.
Damn Lucky was the name of the book, and he was just a wonderful guy. But we ended up continuing to talk,
Yep.
and I got him. He's so kind. He was able to go on Zoom with me and Hudson,
Yep.
my oldest grandson, and Hudson was able to ask him questions about World War II.
So cool.
Yeah, and then later on, I got I bought a model B-17 for your son James,
Right. Yep.
and I told him the story of Lucky Luckadoo, and he loved that. And I told Lucky about it, and I
Hmm.
sent a picture of James with his model B-17 to him, and he loved it. And then, as we know, James had a health problem.
Right. Just 3 months ago, actually, my son James had a seizure, and he was in the hospital for 2 nights. And when he had a what's called a focal seizure, and we didn't know how we were going to find him when he woke up. So he had had a seizure for 30 minutes or so, and when he finally started to come to, because the doctors had to give him a lot of medicine to stop the seizures, and then it made him fall asleep, he got really exhausted. We were worried. We'd never experienced a seizure with either of our kids before, so we didn't know what kind of impact it was going to have on him. And when he finally started to wake up, I'm like, okay, this is it. We're going to see if he knows what his name is, where he is. And one of the nurses, the sweetest person in the world, she was talking with James and trying to ask him questions about things that he likes and what he remembers. And I remember the first question she asked him was, do you know where you are? Are you home? Are you in the hospital? And he looks around and he goes, what kind of doctor's office is this? And I said, James, you're in the doctor's office right now. You're in the ICU. And then she started talking to him about things he likes. And so he started talking about Legos, and he said, I like airplanes. And then she said, oh, what kind of airplanes? And James says, oh, I like B-17 bomber planes. And she said, how do you know about that? Like, she was just kind of shocked that this like tiny little thing, he's only 6, he knew what that was. And I said, James, what what kind of who rode that plane? Do you know? Tell her what you know about it, and not giving him any information. And he looks up at her, and he has like a little shaky voice because he's still kind of weak. And he said, "My grandpa got the plane for me, and who rode it was Lucky Luckadoo."
Oh, oh, yeah,
Sorry.
that gets me. No, you were able to actually catch that last part on
Yeah.
video,
Yep.
and I sent that to Lucky,
Oh gosh.
and he sent me back. He said he was tearing up
Jeez.
on it because that was another benefit of the podcast, because it was stories from Lucky, stories that I told my grandson, and now James learned, but it
Right.
meant something to him, and in
Right.
return, he showed Lucky that he was important.
Right.
You know.
It's not just the benefit of sharing history is not just that it's coming from one person, it could be passed down to other people.
Yes.
It's when the person passing down the information can see the benefit of history, because just like my daughter watching The Wizard of Oz, and you told Betty Ann about that and how much she enjoyed it, and she could see how much it impacted May, and she still loves the movie, she wants to watch it again. And then for Lucky to hear about James being in the hospital, bringing him up to the ICU nurse, like
I
what
know.
6-year-old is talking about the impact that a 102-year-old man had on him? Like that, it means something. It's something that just makes such a difference that you may not know is going to happen for other people, but it does. It makes a really big impact. So just thinking about that story with James, it makes me so glad that, you know, all of these podcasts and a lot of these people that you've interviewed have even impacted our lives, because now whenever I think about Lucky Luckadoo, I've listened to the podcast. It's wonderful, but I also think now I've made that connection with realizing that my son was going to be okay, just emotionally, mentally, when we were experiencing a very scary time for him.
Mhm.
So sorry for the tears.
Oh no worries. No, yeah, a great. It was a really meaningful experience. That was just a couple others. We met two brothers, Robert and Vince Gardino, who wrote a book
Hmm.
called Grave Trippers
That was
about
very cool.
different adventures they had looking up and locating different graves of famous and infamous people. We've become friends. We've had dinner with them and some other guests that we've had. And we just had a good time. And they've been putting us in touch with a lot of really cool future guests and
Yeah.
current guests. So we enjoy that. And then one last one I'll just mention is your mom,
Hmm.
her Uncle Ray, her father's brother. He meant a lot to meant a lot to Mom. He was a person who was always very kind and nice, but he was often, when Mom went to visit Nanny, her grandmother, and
Hmm.
Uncle Ray lived with her, and he often wasn't there because he was out leading Boy Scout uh, adventures, kayaking, canoeing, camping. Boy Scouts also in Brooklyn. There were some organizations, youth organizations that he was helping out there. And I know Mom talked about the poor man passed at 54 years old. He was
Mm.
young, of lung cancer, and I know Mom said when she went to the funeral there were just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of cars and people paying their respect. But I always wanted to, she was 14 at the time, well before I met Mom, but I always wondered who this person was. So I was able to find a gentleman who wrote an article back, I don't know, about 9 years ago, 8 years ago, about this coach that he had back in the 60s named Ray Hunt.
Hmm.
And I contacted this guy through his son and spoke to him and ended up speaking with him and arranging a podcast with Mom and I, speaking to him and I think his brother-in-law and another friend,
Yeah,
now
there are
in their
three of them, right? Yeah.
three in their late 60s, I believe. And they were recalling their times with Coach Ray Hunt on wilderness trips, just what he was like, what made him tick, how much fun he was, how much he cared for his campers,
Yeah.
how much he taught them about canoeing
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
camping and all sorts of things. And they were the three of them were just so joy filled about their memories, remembering stories
Yeah.
about
Yep.
somebody. And in return, they were helping me to know who this man was. And of course, Mom was
Oh,
in tears
gosh.
because, well, where did that come from,
Yeah.
right? Um, anyway, Mom was able to hear wonderful, heartwarming stories. I got to learn who this man was,
Yeah.
and these three gentlemen were just alive with memories. It was so much fun. So those are some of the ones that stand out.
Yeah. I think that's so awesome.
Mhm.
And I remember hearing that podcast about Uncle Ray and, like you said, hearing these three gentlemen talking about him. It's like opening up a window to getting to know somebody that you had never met,
Mm,
right?
exactly.
And even for Mom, hearing about her uncle who she knew, but she may not have known him in that capacity, in that light.
Right.
So it's like it's such a blessing to hear about other people. Like even if you didn't know him, you might want to be like him, right? And if you did know him, now you know him better. And I think that's so important, and that's such a takeaway from listening to your podcast, because there's such a variety of people. They have such an impact on others in different ways, so I feel like it relates to every listener in some way. So just going back for a second, just to your history, your story podcast. Now we're coming up on 4 years, right, since your first episode. That's a long time to have a podcast running, and that's a lot of guests, right?
Mhm.
It's a lot of work. It's so worth it. But what keeps you going with this podcast? Because it, like I said, it is a lot of work. It's a lot of time and energy, and finding guests and taking the time to put all of this together.
Well, first of all, I think being in my 60s now and retired, uh, you may think that, some people when they get older, their world might get a little smaller. Maybe they don't see as many people, meet as many people. Your world could get smaller,
Hmm.
and it depends on what type of person you are. But my I like my home. I like being around home and things like that. Uh, yeah, I could have my books and read my books, but I like people. I like people. And what's happened with this is we have met so many interesting guests. We, uh, Mom and I, when we pick an episode that we're going to try to seek to get a guest, uh, Mom loves human interest stories.
Hmm.
Stories like we did a story recently about two moms who one of the moms' baby passed away, and they donated that baby's heart to the child of the other mom.
Right. They were actually like featured on America's Got Talent. They sang a song together. They both ended up singing to their baby boys when they were in the hospital.
Right, and that,
Yeah.
now how else would we have actually met them? Like we reached out, and they wanted to do our podcast, and just about 3 weeks ago, we had dinner with them
Yeah.
and their husbands. Things like that. Our world has expanded. I've
Yeah.
made, I have a friend. I've got a lot of friends, but I have a friend who's a great great grandson of Ulysses S. Grant, who we interviewed.
Yep.
He's a tremendous guy. Those things. So there's a lot of interest, and I'm reading a ton of books. People are sending me books, and I'm reading them,
Hmm.
and really reading, not just
Skimming.
skimming like I did sometimes in school.
Cliff notes.
Cliff. Who is this Cliff they speak about? Yeah, but just meeting interesting people, reading books, learning, continuing
Hmm.
to grow. The other thing is, I think, is this mission we're on to get people to tell stories and listen to stories
Hmm.
and record stories
Yeah.
wherever you can record them. Now, your story could be something you're telling about another event. We've had a lot of authors who write about different events. We have one coming up that's about um, a famous abolitionist. So we had
Hmm.
an author come in who's going to talk about Charles Sumner, the abolitionist. But we've had another author did a book on Betsy Ross. So these are things that interested them, and they're telling a story. But then we have a lot of people talking about stuff within their family or
Hmm.
experiences that they had. So I think getting people to know the importance of telling the stories, and within families, talk around the dinner table,
Yeah.
listen, those things like that. So we're trying to promote storytelling and listening.
Yeah. So the podcast really, in talking about different people's histories, right, gets to make history kind of come alive again. It brings it to the present moment. And there was something you said to me just the other day about being present that I wanted to read to everybody because I really loved it. You said recalling the past can be an important part of being present, right? And when most people think about history, just off the bat, they think it's in the past, right? How does it relate or matter to the future? And I wanted to ask you about that. Like, what does that quote that you gave to me mean to you?
Well, I have struggled with anxiety probably for a large portion of my life, and sometimes it's situational, sometimes it's just there, general.
Hmm.
And it can be a tough taskmaster. Anxiety, as many people probably know listening to this. And I've always thought, or from what I know, and you're a therapist, so
Hmm.
you can tell me what I'm what
What's
I'm
wrong with
saying,
you?
what's wrong with me here. But I want to say this is that I've always read that you know being present is sort of the challenge, because we can live in the past. We could think about resentment,
Hmm.
regret, maybe sadness sometimes, or we can live in the future, not necessarily like, oh, I can't wait to do this tomorrow. It could be, what if? What
Hmm.
if this happens? What if that happens? Oh, I got too much to do.
Yeah.
The present is the goal,
Right.
being present where you're at. So when I said that about the past, sort of able to bring you into the present, it is that recalling the past, particularly with loved ones or
Mm-hmm.
interested listeners, um, you can be totally present because you're actually telling stories that are connecting you with another human being, to the past,
Mm-hmm.
to loved ones, to interesting stories. And just that process for me
Mm-hmm.
makes me very present,
Yeah.
because when I sat at my grandfather's feet, I hear it is 50 years later, and I'm remembering it like it was yesterday.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I know you have some memories of when you were a kid
Yeah.
with grandma and things like that,
Yeah.
that really helped
I can
you.
still see it. I can still see, the scene from different points in time, especially holidays with grandma and at her apartment when we used to go on Christmas Eve or Easter. Um all the way down to the food that was on the table. I can remember what it smelled like, what it looked like. And the point is, just like you're saying about being present, how you can use history to be present. Yes, I'm a therapist, so I work a lot with people who are struggling with anxiety. And part of how I try to help them, and I honestly do this for myself sometimes too, if I'm feeling anxious, is thinking about a comfort. And a lot of the time, comforts come from things that you've known and things that you've experienced. So I think about my grandma's house because it was a very carefree time. And not just that I enjoyed that, but how I can actually take some of those and bring them in, some of those memories into my present day for my own family. So the history doesn't just have to live in the past. You can transfer it to your life now and work on making some of those core memories for your loved ones that are here. So I want to thank you, Dad, for answering a bunch of these questions, and I think it's going to bless a lot of people, just the fact that you've been able to give them more background on how this podcast came to be. It didn't start at the podcast. This has been since you were a little boy, right? Who knew that the little one sitting at his grandfather's feet listening to these stories was going to be running a podcast that tons of people are going to listen to and benefit from somehow. So you're making history come alive. So thank you very much for that. And before we end, I know that there's some things coming up for your podcast. If you want to share a little bit about what those are with everybody listening.
Absolutely. I'm just going to say one last thing on the being present. Just last week, I was babysitting
Oh,
for
yes.
James,
Yeah.
the B-17 bomber James. And there was a box of memorabilia. There was some things that belonged to my grandfather. There were both grandfathers. There were some old Civil War relics that I had. And the two of us sat down on the floor, and he took one out one at a time and asked me what they were. And I told them stories about it. And do you know, I never feel more present than doing something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I hope that's something that people who listen to our podcast will get out of it. That there's really academic story, like real academics who have written wonderful research books, engaging, but there's people just talking about their family, and they're equally engaging. And I think they bring us to the present as
Mm-hmm.
we look at the past.
Yeah.
So thank you for interviewing me.
My
And your
pleasure.
yes, to your yeah, to your question, we're very excited to announce that soon, as part of our Your History, Your Story, we're going to have something called Stories from My Attic. And in this series, they're going to be short video series about different items that we've taken out of our attic. And I'm going to tell a little bit about those items and how they're important and what kind of stories and people and events are tied into those things. So we're excited about that. Also, we've got some really cool guests coming up. I think you're going to find super interesting. And we're going to just continue bringing stories to you that you can talk about and you can listen to and learn about. But at the same time, we thoroughly encourage you to keep telling stories within your own families. Listen to the stories, tell the stories, and record the stories wherever you can. So on behalf of Your History, Your Story, I want to thank you very much for listening. And Katie, thank you, and have a nice day.